Everyone always thinks the best way to make an avoidant fall for them is to become their perfect, ideal partner, but that's wrong. In fact, I think a pretty strong argument can be made that it's the worst thing you could do. Alright, so a few months ago, I filmed this video where I talk about how avoidants often carry around this secret Frankenstein fantasy of a perfect partner who can override their usual defense mechanism, someone who provides independence and stability and empathy. The idea, of course, is that when a person shows up with these traits, it can bypass the avoidant's usual walls and open the door to a real connection. But there's always a catch when it comes to these things. Showing all of these qualities at once can actually freak them out, because perfection creates pressure, and pressure makes avoidance run. So the real question is, why are avoidants sabotaging when things look so flawless? Now, you might think I'm going to argue that it's because their childhood, how they were neglected, and that may be true, but the reality is that there's a much more complicated reason. And it all revolves around this domino. All right, so we've all seen the viral videos online of people stacking up all these domino lines and then basically tipping them over. It's fun. Every time an avoidant enters into a relationship, they start stacking their own domino line. And what those dominoes really represent are milestones, these almost perfect expectations they want to see play out. Now, at first, everything feels great because the dominoes are stacking up nice and neat. But for an avoidant, looks can be deceiving. All right, so let's play this out. Imagine you're dating an avoidant, and in their mind, the dominoes are starting to stack. So domino 1, you have like this instant attraction. The spark is there right away. Then they stack domino 2. Texting begins to feel easy. It's fun. It's lighthearted. There's no drama. With domino 3, you're showing patience and warmth and empathy. Basically, you're a safe person to be around. Domino 4 gets stacked. You're their peace. You don't pick fights. You feel almost flawless in their eyes. By domino 5, their friends and families are starting to like you. So now it's being reinforced. You're the right choice. With 6, your future goals just happen to line up with theirs. It feels like fate. And then domino 7. You're giving them that unconditional love and stability that they've always wanted. So, this line of dominoes looks perfect, right? Well, yeah, but like I said, there's always a catch. Avoidants tend to build these domino lines with the idea that if one of them wobbles, or if conflict shows up, or the security doesn't feel absolute, the whole structure is going to start feeling at risk. And that's when you start seeing those distancing behaviors come into play. The psychologist and professor of social theory Barry Schwartz wrote in his book called The Paradox of Choice. Apparently, we always think we want choice, but when we actually get it, we may not like it. Meanwhile, the need to choose in ever more aspects of life causes us more distress than we realize. To put it simply, too many good options or too much perfection increases anxiety, not happiness. But it gets even better. In one study cited by Schwartz, Dr. Sheena Lingar at Columbia and Mark Lepper at Stanford set up 2 tasting booths at a supermarket. In one booth, shoppers could sample from 24 different jams. In the other, they only had 6 to choose from. Now, you'd think that more choice equals better, right? But when there were 24 jams, almost nobody bought anything. Only about 3% made a purchase. And when there were just 6 jams, suddenly 30% of people bought a jar. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that too much perfection and too many options actually freezes people. It doesn't make them commit, it makes them panic and back away. And that's exactly what's happening with avoidance. When a relationship looks or feels too perfect instead of feeling safe, their brain is going to say, look, I can't possibly keep this going. If I screw up, this whole thing is going to collapse, just like dominoes. Now, individually, each domino is good, but when stacked in a flawless chain, the avoidance brain sees, look, if one falls, they're all going to fall. And as more dominoes continue to get stacked, the chain gets longer and longer. So while the relationship looks like it's moving forward, inside the avoidance mind, it creates what I like to call this pressure mechanism. All right, so what in the world is a pressure mechanism? Well, it's basically when the avoidant brain turns progress into panic. Now, on the surface, more dominoes means that the relationship is growing. I just basically said that. But to an avoidant, every added domino is another expectation that they're afraid they can't meet. So instead of celebrating how far things have come, they're watching that line get longer and get triggered to run away. And instead of enjoying the beauty of what they've built with you, that pressure becomes overwhelming, and they think that it's really hard to maintain this beautiful relationship. So what are they going to do? Well, they're going to sabotage. They tip themselves out of the game. They pull away before even the first domino falls, because in their mind, it feels safer to leave early rather than to watch the entire structure just get destroyed. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, okay, but how does this pressure actually show up in real life? Well, it doesn't always have to accompany some big dramatic breakup. Most of the time it shows up in these tiny little sabotages. They'll cancel plans at the last minute, or they'll go emotionally cold right after you've had this amazing date. They'll pick fights over something small, or suddenly start questioning the whole relationship out of nowhere. I like to call these micro sabotages, and they're the avoidance way of tipping over one domino early so they don't have to sit in the dread of watching the whole line collapse. Now, to you, it feels confusing and unfair because just yesterday things looked absolutely perfect, but I see this all the time in my weekly group coaching sessions. Which, by the way, you can gain access to in my Seiter super offer. You get weekly group coaching designed to make an avoidant regret leaving. You get access to live streams from me, access to our community, every course I've ever created, all for a massive 50% discount. Now, if you're interested, just simply click the link that you see in the description below. Okay. As I was saying, I see this all the time in my weekly group coaching sessions. Some clients share that when they open up about something vulnerable, a story from the past, or something that really matters, instead of leaning in, their avoidant partner shuts down or goes quiet or changes the subject. That's another domino wobbling, and the avoidant's instinct is to back away. Sometimes it's the smaller things. Things feel easy and you're laughing, and all of a sudden they pick a fight over something small. This will leave you thinking, wait, where did that come from? But that conflict is their subconscious way of putting distance between you to relieve that pressure. And these little moments feel random and confusing when you're on the receiving end, but when you look at it through the domino pressure lens, they make perfect sense. All right, to this point, we've been talking a lot about sabotaging and reference to these dominoes. They want to sabotage things because they're scared, blah, 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 blah. You've heard me talk about this 100 different times. This is nothing new. But there is one other motivation that we haven't really touched on. Sometimes it's not failure that scares avoidance. It's success. All right, when things go well, it means that the dominoes are lining up too perfectly, which might actually make them more anxious and think, wait, this might really work out. That one thought paradoxically creates pressure because now there's more to lose. So what's actually happening in their brain during all of this? Well, the psychology of what's happening here is pretty interesting. There's a trio of reasons at play, and I want to use these three circles to represent them. The first circle will represent anticipatory anxiety. So the idea here is pretty easy. The longer that domino chain gets, the more their brain starts predicting disaster. So instead of waiting for the first domino to fall, they're already imagining the entire line collapsing. And to reduce that dread, they exit early. It's the anticipation of the fall that actually scares them, not the fall itself. The second circle is going to represent negative self-expectancy. This is basically a fancy way of saying they carry this core belief: I'm going to mess this up eventually. The more perfect things look, the heavier the pressure that they'll be exposed as flawed. So by walking away, they regain control. You didn't reject me, I left first. Then our third circle will be the flight reflex. We all know fight, flight, fawn, or freeze. Out of these four, avoidants are most likely to choose flight. When closeness starts feeling like a long chain of expectations they can't keep up with, the instinct is to run. This is not to say that avoidants don't care. They just fear standing in front of dominoes that are destined to fall. But I haven't even gotten to the most ironic part yet. Once they pull away, most avoidants feel this huge sense of relief. It's like, okay, I escaped the collapse. I'm safe again. But that relief is not going to last forever. Once all of the chaos is done, loneliness will start creeping in, and they will miss the comfort and the laughter and the closeness that they had with you. And that's why you often see avoidants circle back. You can actually see this play out in my famous death wheel. They're only going to come back when the pressure feels low again, and they're only going to pull away once the dominoes start stacking too high. And that's this push-pull dance that so many people get stuck in, because avoidants can't help but feeling nostalgic, especially at stage 6 of that avoidant death wheel, but given enough time, they keep revolving around the death wheel and they resurface again like nothing happened. So what if, instead of stacking up these flawless domino lines, we empathize with these circles? You know, their anticipatory anxiety, their negative self-expectancy, and their flight reflex. In other words, we build a relationship that makes them feel safe, that gives them this breathing room that they need and keeps just enough intrigue to make them stay. Now, there are 3 key things that make avoidance stay. Think of these like the counter circles to the original I just showed you: relief, safety, and intrigue. All right, so let's talk about the safe imperfection or the relief circle. So with safe imperfection or relief, dominoes stop lining up in this flawless chain, and instead they leave gaps, messiness, and breathing room. That imperfection feels safe because it means one mistake is not going to ruin everything. With the safety circle, the second thing basically that makes avoidance stay is this shared control or safety. Straight domino lines feel like rails leading straight to a commitment. And what makes them stay is when the relationship has multiple pathways. They feel like they can step closer without losing independence, and as a result, they'll stay longer. And then, of course, we have the third circle, which is the mystery or unpredictability circle. Now, a perfect domino chain is predictable, and for them, that's boring and terrifying. But a stack with curves and spirals and pauses and unexpected designs, that keeps them curious instead of feeling trapped. Because avoidants stay when the relationship feels like a game they can explore, not a test they're doomed to fail. So instead of imagining a straight, fragile line, I want you to picture the dominoes arranged in a circle or a spiral. It's still beautiful, but with no single catastrophic collapse point. All right, so there's one more thing I want to say about avoidance that often goes unnoticed. They aren't just afraid of conflict or commitment. They're afraid of being known. You know, every avoidant I've ever met, whether they realize it or not, carries this belief that if you really saw them, all of their flaws, all of their insecurities, all of their baggage, all of their secrets, you wouldn't stay. So the act of letting you in, of stacking those dominoes with someone who now has a clear view of who they are, that feels really dangerous. So in their mind, before the truth actually gets revealed, it's not rejection if they leave first. And that's why pressure isn't just about milestones or expectations. It's about exposure as well. So what do you actually do with all of this? Should you push harder or prove yourself more? Well, I actually just think that stacks more dominoes and creates more pressure. With avoidance, I think you're going to want to do the opposite. Create space, show self-sufficiency, model that the relationship doesn't have to feel like this collapsing chain reaction. Here's what not to do. Don't issue ultimatums like, hey, commit now or it's over, or don't chase every time they pull back. Don't make the relationship feel like a test that they're bound to fail. Sprinkle in novelty, sprinkle in new experiences, sprinkle in new sides of yourself so the dynamic doesn't feel static. And most importantly, embrace imperfection. A fight, a wobble, a disagreement doesn't have to mean it's game over. The more you can normalize those little imperfections, the safer it feels for the avoidant to stay in the game, because suddenly those dominoes don't look so fragile anymore.